supposed to be presenting in Louisville about an hour and a half ago, and I wore my red shirt, so I have the wrong color on. But I am a Cats fan. Happy that they were 6-0, but I'm glad I made it here to speak to you all tonight. I really appreciate your time. I want to give a couple of shout-outs real quick. Obviously, one to Ryan White and anybody else supporting him, his predecessor, and friend Bechtel, who has set up the SDBO. It's a pretty impressive organization. I've been in dental going on 7 years, and it's a very common conversation to hear about how you all come out of school great clinicians, but you don't get a whole lot of business content in school. And hopefully this will grow and will help other dental students across the country, but hopefully you all leave dental school a little bit more prepared in regard to the aspects of business than you would otherwise. Whether you go into a DSO or you come out and you're associating in private practice, or even if you have the opportunity to come right out of school and do a startup or do an acquisition. Hopefully you'll be a little bit more prepared. So I also want to thank Patterson. I don't think a whole lot of them are here tonight. They actually have somebody retiring, which is fantastic. But Joan is based out of Lexington. I've worked with her quite a bit. She is a fantastic rep, and I really appreciate them. They are a strong team across the state of Kentucky. And it shows by them doing things like this. They try to get out into the dental community, help you all be more prepared for what's to come after school. So thanks, Joan, for being here. I do want to say, I know it's hard a lot of times in larger groups like this. This is for you all. This is not for me, although a lot of this will tell you about Carr and why we're so great. But feel free to ask questions. Feel free to make conversation. I don't care if I get through 5 of these slides. But if you don't, I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes, so feel free to stop me at any time. This is for you all. So a little bit about me. Again, I've been in the dental industry for about 7 years. I was with Henry Schein for about 5. I was a local territory rep just like Joan. Okay. Yeah, so I've been in the dental industry about 7 years. The first 5 was with Henry Schein. I was in a similar role to Jones. I sold your basic consumables and supplies. I was the point of contact for about 150 dentists in my territory, and then for the next year and a half, I sold technology in about 2.5 states, so CAD/CAM, cone beam, sensors, cameras, and software. If you have any questions about that, I'd be happy to help you, but I've been out of the game for a couple of years, so you might want to direct it toward Joan and some of her support behind her. So let me tell you a little bit about Carr, and I'll try to dive into some content for you all. But the easiest way to think about Carr is we are a double niche commercial real estate firm. The first niche is we only do healthcare. The second niche is the one that really separates us, though. So we are a true buyer and tenant only firm, which means I only represent doctors looking to lease or purchase real estate. It's kind of odd to think about, but I'm a commercial real estate agent, but I never list any property. I'll never have a sign in a window. I'll never have a sign out in front of a property with my name and number on it, which means I never represent a landlord. So those are opposing parties in a transaction, tenant and landlord. And typically there's a conflict of interest in real estate. 80% of dentists typically do real estate DIY, and what happens is they go around and call on property themselves, and they're talking to a listing agent whose fiduciary duty is to the landlord. One, they don't have the understanding of a dental office, but 2, they want the landlord to get a better deal as opposed to the doctor because they want to continue to list property for that landlord. Because we don't list any property, we completely eliminate that conflict of interest. I give an unbiased opinion of the market. I give you all the available options. And again, I have the knowledge of a dental office and what to negotiate on and how to negotiate on it. So it makes a really big difference for you all on the front end. So that's a little bit about who we are. Hey, Ryan, do you have that clicker? I know a lot of this doesn't seem like diving in, but I do like to stop on a few of these first few slides. We were founded in 2009. We are the nation's leading healthcare real estate advisor, but the reason I say that is 60% of what we do is dental. That's how we started. So we have a great understanding of the dental industry and, again, about a dental office and how to help you all from the beginning. So I like to stop here as well. We have 150 agents across the country, and we're in 48 to 50 states. And the reason I like to say that is all of you all are not going to stay in Kentucky when you leave. So more than likely, wherever you do go, there's going to be a Carr agent. And the reason that's important is we like to think we do a great job of networking, whether that's we're meeting with dental-specific CPAs, we're meeting with contractors that are known for building dental offices. We can introduce you to the local Patterson team if you need to. We try to surround you all with a dental specific team the best we can. Even Joe Roberts right here with insurance, he works with a lot of dentists. So having as many dental specific people around you can really help. And if you're going to a market where you're unfamiliar with, who to be talking to, we can help you with that. So that's the reason I like to stop on that slide for a second. So our impact, we like to save our clients a lot of time and money. Money is obviously great to save, but time is really important too. You all do not need to be going around calling on property and talking to listing agents yourself. It's more important for you all to be in the office, in patients' mouths, or even at home with family, which is more important than anything. So I'll dive into some more of this in the presentation, but we help you all avoid costly pitfalls. There's a lot of things you need to be aware of on the front end in regard to real estate. Again, I just touched on this. We only represent you all. We never represent the landlord, so we ensure that your interests are protected and first and foremost. And I do like this last point. So we provide a solid game plan. We'll touch on some of the transactions that we can help you all with, but no matter the transaction, we have a similar game plan. We like to look at and negotiate on multiple properties, whether you're purchasing or just leasing. One reason we do that is it allows us to gain leverage on the landlords or the owners. If they know that you all are looking at and negotiating on multiple properties, they know that they're in a competitive situation and have to give you a better deal on the front end because you're going to get it somewhere. Secondly, it's actually kind of a joke, but it's also serious. At Carr, we say every deal dies 3 times. So if for some reason a property falls through, you've got 1, 2, or 3 other properties fully negotiated, and you're not stuck behind the 8 ball and 5 or 6 months behind because you have to go back to the market, negotiate again, start working on your floor plan and things like that. So that's having a solid game plan really helps. I actually forget to mention this quite a bit on the phone, which is kind of funny, but our services are truly free to you all as the doctor. So this is the one commonality that commercial real estate has with residential. The landlords or the owners are the ones that pay the commercial real estate fees. I'm paid by the landlord or the seller. So if you ever work with somebody, whether it's Carr or not, and they're asking you at the end of a transaction to pay their fee, you need to say the landlord's supposed to pay your fee. And I do not make the deal any more expensive. So when we go and call on property, that listing agent already has a commission agreement with the landlord saying, hey, we've got 6% set aside for the real estate fees. I come in and I just negotiate with the listing agent of how to divide that 6% up. So we get paid about 97% of the time at Carr. The 3% we don't, we just do the deal pro bono. So we are there to help you, and we will never ask you to pay our fee, which is a really cool concept. All right, how can we use real estate to build your dream practice? We're going to dive into some more of the content you all want to hear about. But on average, across the country, real estate is the second highest expense in a dental office. It's a little bit different in Kentucky because real estate is relatively a little bit cheaper. But you've got payroll at 23 to 26%. You've got real estate anywhere from 4 to 8%. And then you've got your lab anywhere from 4 to 8%. And then you've got supplies around 5 or 6%. So those are your top 4 expenses in regard to your overhead in the dental office. It's so funny. Nobody has ever talked about real estate in the 7 years that I've been in dental. It's supplies, it's lab, and you can't really negotiate payroll, which is one of the points that we put on here. You can't go to your front office staff and say, hey, we just started this practice. I'm going to have to pay you 10% less than I actually thought I was going to pay you until we really get this going. He or she is probably going to leave and go somewhere else. Whereas real estate is 100% negotiable. There are so many things, and we'll touch on those, that you can negotiate on, and it can make a huge impact on your practice. So the second point's important too, and I'll touch on this a little bit more, but if you lease a space, you're going to be there for 5 or 10 years. And typically there's some annual escalations, which is very common. And the market fluctuates, as we see right now. Prices of real estate are very high. But it's easy to lose track of how long you've been there and for you to be overpaying on your rent. And you only get one chance every 5 or 10 years as it pertains to leasing to renegotiate that lease. And I'll show you an example here in a minute of what it can do. So this is not large enough, unfortunately, but I like telling this story. So this was recent. I've told Joan this one, but this doctor was in southern Indiana, general dentist. He was originally in about 1,700 square feet, just a little bit more, so he had 4 operatories. And he wanted to take some space next to him that was available as well and double in size and get to 8 operatories. So
he had been in his space for 15 years. He had 3 5-year leases. At the end of each 5 years, rent went up 10%, which is very common, again, to have an average of 2% annual escalations. But he did not know that you could renegotiate that lease at the end, renegotiate that rental rate at the end of the lease. So after 5 years, it went up 10%. After 10 years, it went up to 20%. He was about to sign another 5-year lease, and it would have gone to 30%. So you see at the very top, he would have been paying $23.22 a square foot. And the space next door that he was going to take was listed at $17 a square foot online. The landlord and his listing broker are not going to tell the doctor, hey, I'll give this to you for $17 a square foot. It makes a huge difference. So you can't see it real well, but just in regard to rent over the next 5 years, he saved almost $60,000 just by negotiating on the rental rate. On top of that, if you all don't know it already, it's very expensive to build the inside of a dental office. You're looking at anywhere from $130 to $150 a square foot to build a dental office. So he actually had a $330,000 bid from his contractor to freshen his space up that he was in currently and then build out the space next door that he was taking. So, and I'll tell you how we got these concessions here in a little bit, but you can't see it real well. But we actually were able to get him just over $100,000 from the landlord toward that build out. So over 5 years, we saved him about $200,000, which is awesome. And we see that every day, actually. That's not an excessive example by any means, but so to build off of that last slide, obviously a properly or poorly negotiated lease it can cost you or save you tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars. And even if you've been in a space for quite some time, they are opposing parties, tenant versus landlord. Again, this landlord had a listing broker that was handling this negotiation. He was not going to tell the doctor, hey, we've got the space listed next door at $17 a foot, and he was not going to tell him that we'd be happy to contribute toward your build out. So even if you don't have representation, realize who the parties are in the transaction are and who they're representing. So it can really make a big difference. The bottom point is one that I'll build on the next slide, but any savings on real estate is a net savings to the practice. So you don't have to produce another dollar to get your hands on that money. You're saving, that doctor saved $200,000. I'm going to jump to the second point here, which is building off the last slide. But when you bill $1, you do not keep $1 in a dental office. Overhead's anywhere from 60 to 75% in the dental office, so you're keeping anywhere from 25 to 40 cents of every dollar that you bill. So think about it in regard to the last slide. We saved that doctor $200,000. What would he have to produce to actually keep $200,000? $500,000 of production over 5 years. That's a lot of crowns. That's a lot of fillings. Hopefully you're doing implants if you're trying to make that up. But it makes a big difference, and people don't think about it that way, but yeah, he would have had to produce $500,000 to make up that $200,000. So, strategic lease negotiations can have an exponential impact on your profitability. So I'm going to go back to that doctor in Southern Indiana. So I got his permission before I did this. So we always try to create leverage. I told you we like to negotiate on multiple properties. He did not want to move, which is understandable. But I asked him if he was okay if I said that, hey, we're going to look at moving and buying something or building because your CPA and your lender said financially that makes more sense for you. He said, yeah, I'm fine with that. So we go back to the landlord and tell him that. He's had this tenant for 15 years, hasn't caused any problems, hasn't missed any rental, hasn't missed any payments. And all of a sudden he's worried about losing that tenant, and that's how we were able to achieve a $100,000 build-out allowance and dropping the rent substantially. So this is a great slide too. I like stopping on this one. So first impressions, you can see at the bottom, the doctor is actually the fourth impression that a patient gets from your dental office. And things that I think a lot of times you all don't think about are things that I do think about is, is it easy to get in and out of your space? Can you turn left at the busy times of day when it's 3 o'clock and kids are out of school, or 5 o'clock when people are leaving work? Is it easy to find if it's not visible off of the main road? Is there enough parking, or are people worried about backing up and hitting another car? When they walk in, is it old carpet on the floor and there are water stains on the ceiling? Or is it fresh and does it smell nice? And then after that, they meet the front staff, where they checked in efficiently, where they greeted nicely, or their water's in the waiting room, things like that. And then third, hygienists. They are the motor to a practice. Hopefully those patients are coming in every 6 months. They see that hygienist, and a lot of times they can create more patient acceptance than you ever could, just because they have a relationship with that patient. So that hygienist is really important. And then fourth is the doctor. Again, you may come spend 5 or 10 minutes with somebody at the end of a check and end of a hygiene cleaning, but so it's really funny. You got to think about those things on the front end, because it does make a difference in how people perceive you. I know all of you all are probably great clinicians, but unfortunately, the people sitting in your chair probably are not going to know the difference if you're a great doctor or a bad doctor. So they know what type of experience they have, not necessarily the type of dental work that they're getting. This is a great slide. I could probably talk on this one for 30 or 40 minutes in itself, but I'm going to touch just on a few of these. I get the question a lot, is it always better to own? No, definitely not. But in a lot of cases, it is. If you buy a piece of real estate at the right price, or you do your due diligence on the front end, a high majority of the time it is better long-term financially. It does affect your cash flow, and I'm going to jump to tax implications down below. You get a lot of tax advantages from owning your real estate, and that affects your cash flow a lot, and we can talk about that more offline. But if you have the opportunity to buy some real estate, it's not a bad idea to entertain. To build on that a little bit, principal pay down and equity. If you own something, you're paying down the principal, you're building equity within that, and you have to think about it in terms of, well, what if I want to remodel my space in 15 or 20 years? I can pull that equity out, remodel my space. What if I want to buy another location, buy another practice and have a second location? You can use that with the bank as leverage. So if you're leasing, you don't have those advantages. And then exit strategy is a great one to talk about too. So I feel like I've talked to so many doctors and been in so many situations with doctors, and they hadn't necessarily thought about, okay, what does this look like when I retire? So start thinking about that sooner rather than later if you are buying into a practice. In regard to the real estate, it's, if you own the real estate, do you want to sell the practice and the real estate? A lot of times the real estate is worth more than the practice. And I'm not saying that that's not a good practice that you have. Do you want to sell the practice and lease the real estate and have some passive income? Or do you never want to own your real estate and just have a fixed price on your rent and just sell your practice? So those are things you need to be thinking about. Have a good CPA around you, have a good lender around you, and they can all talk you through those things too on the front and the back end. So be thinking about exit strategy early on, especially if you're thinking about practice ownership. So a few of these are good to talk about as well. We have our own terminology just like you all do in dental. But if you wanted to expand on a space, I actually just helped my future sister-in-law. She left a DSO, is doing a startup, and she's moving into about 2,400 square feet into a retail space. And that's about 6 operatories. She wanted the ability to have 8 operatories at some point. The space next to her was already leased, but we asked the landlord for the first right of refusal. So if that tenant decides to move out, she has the option to take that before anybody else does. He cannot go lease that to somebody else before asking her if she wants it. So if she wants the ability to have 8 ops when that tenant moves out, that's her option to do so, which is really nice for her to have. If you're buying a practice in the future, it's typically a pretty simple assignment of the lease if the doctor is leasing their space. So you're buying a practice, say the doctor has 4 years left on their lease, they can do a simple assignment of the lease to you. That way that liability is on you all now and not the previous doctor. Possible ownership. I'm actually working with a pediatric dentist right now, and she's leasing her space, but she wanted to own her real estate, and we asked on the front end, hey, would you give us a purchase option? So anytime after year 3, she has the option to purchase that real estate. And The same as the first point there, the first right of refusal, she has that as well. That way, if that landlord decides to sell that property in year 2, she has the option to buy that first before anybody else. The next one is a great one. So I don't know if you all have even heard or thought about exclusivity, but again, this pertains to leasing more than anything. But you can ask for an exclusivity of the space. So if you're in a retail center around Kroger and you don't want any other dentist, that's something that you can negotiate on the front end. I actually was working with a veterinarian. It was sometime last year, and I was looking at this Kroger anchored center. There was already a veterinarian in there, and this group I'm working with is great. They're nice people. They would not go in there just for the sheer fact there was a solo practitioner in there working. But I called on it just out of curiosity and said, hey, I see you have a veterinarian in there. I've got a great group practice looking to add another location. Do they have an exclusivity? And they said, no, we'd love to have another veterinarian. I mean, that vet could have been there for 5 or 10 years, paying rent, not causing any problems, and as an asset to that center. And they were willing to lease to another veterinarian, which is not very good for that vet. But so entity selection and tax benefits, you'll work with your attorney on that entity selection. There's PLLC, there's LLC. I don't necessarily know the advantages to those, but they can walk you through that. But if you do own your real estate and your practice, you'll set up a practice entity, you'll set up a real estate entity, and the practice will pay the real estate entity. That way you can write off your rent. Rent is completely tax deductible, so you actually get the opportunity to set your own rental rate within reason, and that way you can write off your rent if you own your practice, so you're actually paying a different entity. Transaction opportunities. The first 5 are pretty self-explanatory, but I do want to stop on the last 2. So lease renewals. I kind of touched on that earlier with the doctor in Southern Indiana, but lease renewals are the number 1 real estate transaction that happen every year. But a lot of times they go unnoticed because the tenant, including doctors, do not know when their lease is going to end. So there's typically a renewal notification period on a lease. It's usually 90 to 180 days out. The landlord will come in and say, hey, your renewal notification period is here. Here's a new lease. At that point, you do not really have an option to move if you want to, because it takes at least 5 months to build out the inside of a dental office. So we love to get ahead and get a year out on those lease renewals. So just like the guy in Southern Indiana, we had a year window. If he actually wanted to move, we had time to go look at the market, look at property, negotiate on property, and well before his renewal notification period. So if you're going to take anything away from tonight, if you're leasing space, know when your renewal notification period is. Put it in your calendar 5 or 10 years out, and that way you know exactly when it is, because the landlords a lot of time will bring that lease in. The rent is escalating. You're not asking for any concessions, and you've got the same space that you've had for the last 5 or 10 years, and rent's typically going up. So if there's anything you can take away, please take that away. Practice transitions. There's always a real estate component to a transition. Either the selling doctor of the practice also owns the real estate, and they want to sell that together, or they want to lease it to you. And a lot of times, the doctor that owns the practice does not own the real estate. They're obviously paying rent to a third-party landlord. And there's some opportunity there, too, to renegotiate a lease depending on how much time is left on that lease. So I'm not going to run through the pros and cons of all of these, but the 3 that you all are going to see more often than not are office space, retail space, and medical office buildings. Office space, you can kind of think of that more in the line of having maybe CPAs, an insurance group, attorneys. It's typically not road frontage. You don't have as much visibility. You don't get as much exposure. But parking can sometimes be an issue if there are more than 3 or 4 other healthcare practitioners in there. You all may have 4 or 5 patients. You may have 6 or 7 staff members. You may have your supply rep there. You may have an equipment rep there. You could have 8 to 12 people there at any given time. If there's 3 or 4 doctors in that space, parking could be limited, so that's one thing that you'll want to look out for. Costs on office buildings are typically a little bit lower because of there's not as much visibility. Visibility typically requires a little bit higher rent. Natural light and windows. Every time I ask, what are you looking for in a space? Windows is the one or two things that you all say, which I get. But office space typically has quite a few windows, which is nice. So retail is what I see more than anything. Obviously, it has great visibility. Access is typically pretty easy. It's usually at a light. It's easy to turn in and out of. There's plenty of parking. One of the cons of retail space is the windows. There's an end cap. There's one end cap, and there's another end cap, and then if you're not on one of those end caps, you basically have some windows on the front of that building, and that's about all the window access that you have. So I do have a love-hate relationship with visibility too. So it's great to build your brand, but typically you're going to pay more in rent, which means you have less of a say of how you're going to market if you're budgeting for marketing. I'm a big believer in search engine optimization. I think as long as people can find you if you're not on the main road, if they can find you when they get off the main road, I think it's more important to pop up with one of the first 2 or 3 dentists when people look you up on the internet, and then Google reviews. I'm not saying visibility is bad. It's not bad at all, but I think a lot of doctors really get stuck on visibility when people are not going to drive by the practice more than likely and say, oh, I've seen that dentist 10 times. I think I'm going to switch dentists and go there. They're going to look you up online and look at your Google reviews and probably make a decision from there or get a referral from a patient you already had. So visibility is great, but do not make that the one and only decision on the real estate. Medical office buildings, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's an office building full of, obviously healthcare practitioners. Parking is not a problem. Landlords have game plan for that and know that there's going to be a lot of parking there. We can dive into this more after if you want to call me about it, but you'll see a lot more full service leases as opposed to triple net where all of your expenses are included in one rental rate as opposed to having a rental rate and then your triple nets, which is a payment on top of your rent. But that's some of the positives and negatives of 2 or 3 of those. All right, landlord motivations. They obviously want to get as much rent out of their buildings as they can because if they go to sell that building, that's what it's valued off of. So the higher the rent, the more that building is going to sell for. And even if they don't want to sell that building, that's more money in their pocket. They are willing to give significant concessions, and I'll actually show you another example here in just a second. They are willing to give significant concessions to desirable tenants. You all probably don't know this, but dentists, whether they're doing a startup or an acquisition, have less than a % default rate. Now, that doesn't make you feel any easier about doing a startup, but if you all go do a startup, there's a 99.whatever% chance that you're going to succeed. And it's important for landlords to know that because we're going to ask for a lot on the front end, and that's one of the selling points. On top of that, you move about once every 15 years. It's expensive to build out. You're worried about losing patients if you move. And again, they need to know that. You might sign a 5 or a 10-year lease, but you could be a 15 or a 20-year tenant, and they need to give on the front end to get such a low-risk, long-term tenant like you all. Obviously, healthcare is great. Just kind of touched on that. This top point, I love talking about this top point. And again, it goes back to how you all, 80% of doctors take a DIY approach to real estate. These are real estate professionals, the landlords, and they still hire representation. So what does that say about it? I don't know why, and I don't know what it is, but it amazes me that people take that DIY approach. But again, it's really important. Know the parties in the transaction. Whoever sign is in the window is representing the landlord. Again, just be very cognizant of that. That way, if you're doing it on your own or working with another company, you at least know who the parties in the transaction are. Some common misconceptions about representation. I've kind of already touched on the first 2, but hiring an agent will cost me money. That is completely false. That commission percentage is negotiated on the front end before you ever call on that property. And it's just between the 2 listing brokers of how they divvy up that 5 to 7%. Doesn't make it any more expensive. My attorney can handle my real estate negotiation. There are a lot of great real estate attorneys out there, but I would not necessarily advise that just for the sheer fact that they probably don't know dental. They don't know the HVAC and electrical specs that you all need. They don't know how many square feet you need for 6 ops. I don't want to try to interpret legal jargon, so I wouldn't necessarily want them negotiating on your dental real estate either. They do have a role in every transaction. I would highly advise, whether you're looking at a lease or you're looking at a purchase contract, get an attorney involved. I worked with a doctor on a land purchase down in Bowling Green, and they were from more of a rural area. And I said, "Hey, do you have a real estate attorney?" And they said, "Nah, we don't really like attorneys." And I referred somebody in, and they told me after the fact, "I'm really glad that we had an attorney working for us because there's just things that you don't see in a contract and that you need help being advised through." So always have an attorney on board. I'm going to skip the residential agent. All commercial agents are the same. To touch on that briefly, there's agents that obviously only do healthcare. There's agents that do industrial and warehouse. There's agents that only do land development. There's agents that only do office space. So even if you don't use Carr, ask somebody if they have some healthcare experience, specifically dental. So everything is negotiable. I mentioned this earlier. Obviously, lease rate. I want to stop on annual escalations a minute. I've mentioned those. It is very common to have annual escalations in a lease, especially if it's long term. The landlord wants to see their asset appreciating. They don't want to see it stagnant. Now, we try to limit that. A lot of times you'll see a 3 or 4% annual escalation in rent. I actually saw one today that was between 7 and 8%, which is a crazy amount of escalation. But it's okay to have those, but you need to try to get those under wraps because a percent here and there over 5 or 10 years can make a huge difference. Another one I want to point out is build-out period. So it's always important to negotiate a build-out period. It takes anywhere from 4 to 5 months to build out the inside of a dental space, and you do not want to be paying rent while you're not working. I talked to a doctor last year. I was too late, really, to not necessarily too late, but he was about to sign a lease, and I said, "Hey, what's your rental rate? Where are you going? Do you have any free rent? What's your build-out period?" He said, "What is that?" I mean, it obviously kind of explains itself, but he said, "I didn't know that I could have one of those." So he was about to sign a lease, was going to be paying rent for the next 5 or 6 months while he built his space out. It's just not a great way to get started. Improvement allowance. I touched on this in the example in Southern Indiana. Landlords will give build-out allowances toward your space, especially when you're going to be there long term. Free rent's another great one. Especially if it's a startup, I love to see some free rent. The one that Joan and I worked on, we got her a 5-month build-out period. I'll actually show you this example in a second. We got her a 5-month build-out period and 3 months of free rent. So once she's open, she's got no rent and no triple net expenses for the first 3 months while she starts to see patients. This is hard to see too, but this is actually the one that Joan and I worked on, which was a great one. So their initial proposal was, she was looking at about 3,000 square feet. This doctor she'd been out practicing for a while. She actually did general dentistry for a while, went back to pedo school. And she knew exactly how much square footage she needed to be in practice for the next 20 years, even if she added an associate. So this was great. She had just over 3,000 square feet. The initial proposal was at $29 a square foot, which was just about $7,300 a month. We actually were able to get it down to $25 a square foot, which is $1,000 less a month, and she's looking at a 10-year lease. So we dropped rent $130,000 or $40,000 over 10 years. Got her 3 months of free rent when she opened. I typically assume $150 a square foot to build out dental. We were very fortunate here, and actually it got cut off, but the landlord was putting in HVAC and electrical at the specs that she needed for the dental office at his cost. So instead of assuming $150 a foot, I assumed $135 a foot. HVAC and electrical are your second and third biggest cost behind plumbing in a dental practice in regard to building it out. So that was huge. We were still able to get her $50 a square foot toward the build out, which is just over $150,000, which with rent and the build out allowance in itself, that was over a $200,000 swing for her that she did not have to pay for over the next 10 years or in the build out, which is great. So That was one that, I couldn't believe how much of a difference it was. So back to posture really quick about negotiating on multiple properties. We had another property that had a much lower lease rate and was giving her $70 a square foot as opposed to $50 at this space. She didn't really want to go in that space, but we used that as leverage to get the rental rate down and to keep that build-out allowance. I went back to the property she wanted, which is here, and said, hey, she's a low-risk, long-term tenant. We've got a much better deal elsewhere. It's a $200,000 or $300,000 difference in your all's proposals. If you really want her, you need to drop the rental rate and keep the build-out allowance, and they actually did, which is awesome. Obviously, just building off of this, posture is mandatory. This is how the landlord feeds their family, and they're not going to give unless they have to. If they know you're only looking at one property, they know they don't have to give as much. And I would say if you do this yourself or even use another agent, don't play a card you don't have. That's one thing that I learned at training, which was great advice. You can bluff all day long, but when we go negotiate on multiple properties and get good terms elsewhere, you can say, hey, we've got this. And you can use that to your advantage. So a great point that we make in this slide is, and crazily enough, we're seeing this in the residential market, but if you were to list your house for $500,000 and somebody came and said, I'll give you $550,000, would you say, no, I'll give it to you for $500,000? Probably not, unless you're nicer than I am. But that's the same way with the landlords. The guy in Southern Indiana, they are not going to tell him, hey, the space next to you is listed at $17 a foot. You're 30% over market. They're not going to do that. What is fair market? Again, it helps you all learn. Again, you may do 3 or 4 real estate transactions in your career, but when you go and look at multiple properties and negotiate on them, you get a feel of what fair market is. You understand why you're paying more when you're next to a Kroger as opposed to an office space that's maybe half mile off the main road. Things like that. So that helps you all gain some knowledge too and make you feel good about the decision you're going to make. Questions a landlord asks its broker. Does the tenant have a broker? And if they do they know the market? And do they have other viable options? It's pretty straightforward. They're going to ask those questions and get as much information about you all as possible. It's funny, when I take doctors to tour, I say, hey, 10 or 15 minutes in and out of the space. They're going to try to ask you questions. How long have you been practicing, or, where are you located? They try to find as much information about you as possible so that they know what to tell their landlord of, I think we need to give this, or I don't think we need to give this. So in a renewal or a startup situation, they will ask, are they willing to move, or are they willing to walk? So just like the pediatric dentist that Joan and I worked on, she was willing to walk from the space that she wanted because the other space was such a great deal, and it was in a good location that she liked. She had 2 options that she would have moved in. Now, one was much more favorable than the other for her. But, it's nice to have another option that you're willing to go with. What's the most we can get them to pay? Obviously, again, the more that rent's for, the more that building's worth. So that's a question they're going to ask every time. This is a great slide. I like this one a lot. So appropriate time frames. On a new lease, you're looking at 9 to 12 months. For the first 5 or 6, you're going to be looking at property. You're going to be negotiating on property. You are going to be working on a floor plan with whichever distribution team you're working with. You're going to be working with a contractor on getting a bid on that layout to take to the bank. You're going to work with Patterson or whoever it is on equipment selection. You're going to take that bid to the bank. And you're going to be working on signage and a lot of things. So it seems like a long time, but it can go very quick. And then the last 5 or 6 months, you are building your space out. So 9 to 12 months. Building purchase, very similar. If it's not already built out dental, same thing. Looking at property, negotiate on property, layouts, equipment, contractor bids, things like that. Renewal, we've touched on that one. You want to get a year out of that, a year out on that. A lot of times, again, it's 3 to 6 months is when your renewal notification period is, and you want to already have gone to the market and negotiated on other properties to go back to your landlord and say, hey, we have X, Y, and Z elsewhere. I know that I'm 20% over market. I need some fresh paint and flooring. Or, I've hired Carr to show me other properties and potentially move. Land purchase, Man, those take a long time. 18 to 24 months, every bit of it. So if you all ever have a desire to build and go ground up, give yourselves plenty of time, especially if you're leasing somewhere or maybe even own another property and plan on moving. Give yourself plenty of time. Acquisition can be much quicker. Again, you're buying a practice and it can be a simple assignment of a lease. If you are purchasing the real estate too, it can take a little bit longer, but you're not looking more than 3 or 4 months. A lot of this is a little bit repetitive, but common mistakes. I'm going to skip to the second one. Again, this kind of goes back to leasing. Allowing the landlord or seller to initiate the negotiations. You always want to be the first one to send terms to the table and not the landlord. Again, that's important why you want to know when that renewal notification period is. That way you can send terms to the landlord and say, hey, I know I'm over market. This is what I want the rent to look like, et cetera, as opposed to them coming in, sliding you a lease and saying, hey, here's your new lease, rent's escalating. You know, you don't really have an option to move at that point. The third point is a great one too. If you are ever leasing space, or even if you purchase space and you have somebody next to you, don't necessarily determine market value by what they paid. You know, you might be next to an optometrist and you're leasing space, and they might be paying $1.50 less than you in rent, but you don't necessarily know if they had a concession package like you're going to get. They may not have gotten a build-out allowance. They may not have gotten free rent. They may not have gotten an HVAC and electrical paid for by the landlord. So rent is not the only thing to be cognizant of, and don't think that you got a bad deal if you're paying a little bit more rent than somebody else. That's the only thing I wanted to touch on there. That's it. Any questions? I ran through that much quicker than when I practiced. Feel free to grab me afterward, email me, call me, text me. Be happy to answer any questions you all have. Yeah.
For D4s coming out, I mean, what is the likelihood? I mean, what have you seen people do when they come straight out? I mean, I would assume either buying a practice. I mean, is that typical? How likely is it that you'll actually buy the building?
That's a great question. I typically don't see many people that are able to come out of school and buy a practice or do a startup just strictly because banks are going to look at cash flow, and with the amount of debt that you all have, it's a little bit tougher. They like to see some production history too. Most banks do, at least a couple of years. So I think having a goal of maybe year 3 or into year 2, if you want to have some ownership pretty quick, that's a great way to do it. If you do want to own, it's still going to be tough in year 2 unless you've really paid down that debt. But again, that's when you can start looking at buildings with a purchase option or the first right of refusal to buy. So it is difficult to do that.
Can you do that within your first year of ownership? Can you build that into the agreement? That in 3 years I want to buy this building?
Yes, that is something that you can ask for, and I've seen people get. Absolutely. Yeah.
Sam, just repeat the question so Will can hear you.
Okay.
It's kind of piggybacking off of that and a little bit more of a bank, but with your clients, because I've heard, don't refinance your loans because banks like to see student debt versus personal debt. Have you personally tried to tell people who are, oh, hey, just keep your student loans, pay them off that way, and then refinance after?
That's a good question. That honestly depends on the bank. So a lot of your larger banks, sorry, I'll repeat her question. She asked should you refinance your loans or should you not? Say that again for me.
It's just if you're trying to buy,
Yeah.
you refinance your loan because most banks like student debt versus personal debt.
Oh, they like student debt versus personal debt.
It looks a little bit better.
Yes. Yeah, they're expecting that debt.
Yeah.
That debt come out of school. Now, the personal debt does not look good. You're correct. That's honestly something. It depends on the bank. It really does. So your bigger banks like Bank of America, Huntington, Wells Fargo, they have more boxes to check than maybe a local or regional bank that you all might know from maybe being in a hometown or something. They don't have as many boxes to check. Now, you do not want to put a bunch of personal debt, whether it's somebody you know or you're using a Bank of America. They're expecting that practice debt, but they're all looking at cash flow and based off your projections and things like that. But honestly, that would be a great question for a financial advisor and a lender. So, good question though. Sorry I don't have a better answer for you. Anybody else?
Do you guys also do purchasing properties? Because you talked mostly about leasing, but you guys also negotiate the purchases?
Yeah, we do purchases all the time. Leasing, there's just, that's where we see the most amount of savings is on leasing. Purchasing though, you typically have a due diligence period of anywhere from 75 to 90 days. And that entails a lot. So having help getting through that, whether it's lending and getting your survey done on the land or getting inspection done on a building, we can walk you through that too. But yeah, we do anything real estate related, whether it's leasing or purchasing.
When you're purchasing practice from a doc, is it more common for them to lease to you or to set up to where you're going to buy the property later on if they own both?
Yeah, that's a good question. He asked if you're buying a practice, does the doctor typically lease you the building or do they set it up where you can buy it? Typically, I see the doctor is going to set it up where you can buy it. After a certain amount of time, again, it depends on their exit strategy. They might want to lease that property. It might be paid for, and might have some rental income for a little while. But they typically want to have a plan to get rid of the real estate too. As they get older, they don't want to have to take care of that building, and they do want to sell it. So yes. Anybody else?
Would purchasing real estate like a home while in dental school, would that affect your ability to buy a practice after? Or things like that negatively own property currently?
So they will. He asked if buying a house during dental school is kind of frowned upon by the bank. Yes and no. So it actually goes on your personal financial statement as an asset. So it actually helps your net worth in regard to looking at a personal financial statement. But if you have overbought, it does affect that. They factor those things into your cash flow when you're buying a practice or doing a startup. So if you have gone and outpaid for something or bought something you don't necessarily need to buy yet, that will affect how they look at your cash flow in your practice. Most banks that understand dental are going to know that you have $300,000 of student debt. They're going to know that you have a couple cars, and they're going to expect you to probably have a house at that point. You're going to be 26 to 30 or 35 years old, depending on when you come to dental school. So it can be a great thing, and it can also not if you've overbought.